Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the Rushline Environmental Assessment Virtual Open House. My name is Adele Hall, and I'm on the Rushline team. We will begin today's virtual open house with a 35-minute presentation about the environmental assessment and the Rushline project more broadly. Following the presentation, there will be time available for questions and answers. If you have a question you'd like to ask of staff, we will be answering questions in two ways. The first way we'll be answering questions is the written questions. So if you'd like to write your question, feel free to do so at any time using the Q&A feature in the panel at the very bottom of your screen. If you click on that, you can type your question in the box. So the team will, after the presentation, the team will first respond to those written questions, and then we'll also have a time for verbal questions to be asked as well. And we will have an opportunity to ask those questions in Hmong, Spanish, Korean, and English. And all questions will be responded to verbally.
Hello, I am Ramsey County Commissioner Victoria Reinhardt. Welcome to the Rushline BRT Project Environmental Assessment Open House. Your review of and feedback on this key document is important and will help inform Rushline's next steps towards providing a safe, clean, and quiet all-day connection to jobs, businesses, shopping, medical facilities, entertainment venues, and more. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Reinhardt, for those welcoming remarks. My name is Andy Gitzloff, Senior Transportation Planner at Ramsey County, and I would first like to start this virtual open house with a land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hopes of a better life, and some had lived on this land since immemorial. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We are standing on the ancestral lands of the Dakota people. We want to acknowledge the Ojibwe, the Ho-Chunk, and the other nations of people who also call this place home. We pay respects to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the treaties made by the tribal nations that entitle non-Native people to live and work on traditional Native lands. Consider that many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today, and please join us in uncovering such truths as any and all public events. Our topics for today that we would like to cover are first to go over the virtual meeting procedures, followed by more detail on where to view the environmental assessment and how to comment. Then we will be providing project background and overview, an overview of the environmental assessment, including its purpose and the topics covered within the documents. And then we will cover next steps. And after the presentation portion, we will break and there will be a question and answer period with project staff. Now to go over the virtual meeting procedures. Attendees may ask questions by using the Q&A or the raised hand feature only during the discussion period of the open house. The host will unmute you in the order of hands raised. This open house is being recorded and a summary of the Q&A will be provided in the environmental decision document. Email avalenti@srfconsulting.com if you're having issues connecting. Closed captioning and interpretation services are available for this meeting. Select your preferred language by clicking the globe icon at the bottom of the screen. The EA can be viewed at many different places. www.rushline.org can be viewed online. There are also a number of locations throughout the east side of the metro where the document can be reviewed, including the Ramsey County Library, the East Side Enterprise Center, the Ramsey County Library in Maplewood, Vadnais Heights City Hall, Gem Lake City Hall, and Ramsey County Library in White Bear Lake. Please check with each organization before visiting, as their hours may be different due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We are also interested in receiving your comments on the environmental assessment document, and they can be submitted in a variety of ways. Submitting official comments can be submitted via email to info@rushline.org. You can also visit the environmental process page and fill out a comment form on rushline.org, or you can mail the comment letters to Andy Gitzloff, Senior Transportation Planner at Ramsey County, and the address is 15 West Kellogg Boulevard, Suite 210, Courthouse, St. Paul, Minnesota, 55102. All substantive comments will be responded to in the environmental decision documents, which will be published later.
Thank you. My name is Frank Alarcon. I'm a transit planner at Ramsey County Public Works and the Deputy Project Manager for the Rushline BRT project. I'll be sharing about the project's background and giving an overview of the project. First, I'll review the project's timeline. From 2014 to 2017, Ramsey County led the pre-project development study. This study evaluated 55 route segments and 7 forms of bus and rail-based transit to identify what's called the locally preferred alternative. The locally preferred alternative is a route and a mode of transit, in this case, bus rapid transit. The current phase of work is the environmental analysis phase, which began in 2018 and is also led by Ramsey County. As the name suggests, a key task of the environmental analysis phase is preparation of an environmental assessment to document any potential environmental impacts of the project. In order to evaluate environmental impacts, a certain amount of engineering must be done to identify the infrastructure that will be constructed as part of the project. So preliminary engineering is another key task of this phase of work. Preliminary station area planning work has also been performed. Station area planning focuses on refining station locations, identifying ways to improve biking and walking connections near stations, and identifying economic development opportunities near stations. All of this work has been informed by public engagement. During the environmental analysis phase, project staff have connected with more than 3,400 community members at over 160 community events, pop-up meetings, open houses, virtual events, and through a variety of other forums. The public comment period for the environmental assessment is one of the last steps of the environmental analysis phase. When this phase of work concludes later this year, the leadership of the project is expected to transition from Ramsey County to the Metropolitan Council. The Metropolitan Council will lead the project through final engineering and construction and ultimately operate the Rushline BRT as part of the regional transit system. Construction is expected to begin in 2024 and finish in 2026. Here's some more detail about the locally preferred alternative, which again is the project's route and the mode of transit. So the mode of transit for the Rushline is dedicated guideway, BRT. What dedicated guideway means is that for a large portion of the Rushline's route, the bus will operate in its own dedicated lane, which speeds up the service and makes it more reliable. The Rushline will have frequent service from early in the morning to late at night, approximately every 10 to 15 minute service for most of the day. The route, if you're starting in downtown St. Paul, will operate largely on 5th Street and 6th Street and Robert Street within downtown. Then it takes Jackson over to Phelan Boulevard, north of downtown and on the east side. And then it will operate within the Ramsey County Rail right-of-way on the east side and into Maplewood. So that's the yellow portion of the map. And within the Ramsey County Rail right-of-way, the Rushline will share the right-of-way with a reconstructed Bruce Bento Regional Trail. North of the Ramsey County Rail right-of-way, the Rushline will largely operate on Highway 61 into downtown White Bear Lake. Also part of the project involves exploring potential future bus connections to Hugo and Forest Lake, as well as other bus system improvements to help facilitate transfers to and from the Rushline. This graphic shows the region's future rapid transit network and how the Rushline, which is in the top right-hand corner in purple, fits into that system and connects to other corridors. Next, I'll review the characteristics of BRT that make it a high-quality form of transit service. One characteristic is that BRT vehicles operate largely in their own dedicated lanes, which speeds up service and makes it more reliable because buses are separated from general traffic. BRT buses also run frequently, every 10 to 15 minutes in both directions for most of the day. This allows people to use the service for many types of trip throughout the day and not have to rely on a schedule. BRT stations have many amenities that create a safe and comfortable environment for riders. These amenities include shelter, heat, and real-time departure signs. Raised platforms allow riders to enter and exit buses more easily. Riders pay their fares at the station rather than on the bus, speeding up the boarding process and allowing riders to board at any door. BRT vehicles are modern, state-of-the-art buses. The Rush Line's environmental assessment assumes that electric buses will be used for the Rush Line BRT. Now I'll hand it over to Jessica Lobbs, environmental lead for the Rush Line project, to discuss the environmental assessment.
We will now provide an overview of the environmental assessment. An environmental assessment is an analysis required by the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, that evaluates impacts and benefits from proposed projects. The purpose of an environmental assessment is to ensure the project complies with environmental laws, to evaluate project benefits and impacts to environmental, social, economic, and transportation resources. If necessary, it identifies solutions to avoid, minimize, and mitigate project impacts. And it also serves to inform the public and agencies about impacts as part of the decision-making process. There are many agencies involved in preparation of the environmental assessment for the Rush Line BRT project. Because Ramsey County and the Metropolitan Council will pursue project funding through the Federal Transit Administration's Capital Investment Grants Program, the Federal Transit Administration is the lead governmental agency for preparation of the environmental assessment. Ramsey County is the project sponsor and the responsible governmental unit for the state environmental review process. The Federal Highway Administration is a cooperating agency. In this role, they will provide input on the project's purpose and need, impacts, the definition of alternatives, and the resource analyses. This image depicts the decision-making process for the environmental assessment, starting with where we are today. Currently in step 1, we are in the agency and public review period for the environmental assessment. Once that review period is over, the Federal Transit Administration and Ramsey County will review all of the comments. In step 3, the Federal Transit Administration will issue an environmental decision document. This will respond to substantive comments on the environmental assessment and identify ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate impacts. This document will also determine that the project does not have significant impacts or that it requires additional analysis. In step 4, if the Federal Transit Administration finds that no additional analysis is required, it will issue a finding of no significant impact. At this point, the project can continue into design and eventually construction. If it's determined that additional analysis is needed to obtain environmental approval, an environmental impact statement will be prepared for potentially significant impacts, or additional analysis will be completed under the environmental assessment. In either option, there will be opportunity for agency and public review and comment. Once the Federal Transit Administration determines that no additional analysis is needed, the project can move into step 5, final design and engineering, and then eventually construction. There are a wide range of topics covered in the environmental assessment, including the project's purpose and need, a summary of public and agency coordination, a description of the alternatives evaluated, analysis of transportation, community and social, physical and environmental, and Section 4F resources, consideration of indirect effects and cumulative impacts, and an assessment of Section 106 resources, which include historic and cultural elements. The purpose of the Rush Line BRT project is to provide transit service that satisfies the long-term regional mobility and accessibility needs for businesses and the traveling public and supports sustainable development within the study area. The specific needs driving this project include serving the needs of people who rely on transit, meeting increasing demand for reliable, high-frequency transit service, planning for sustainable growth and development, and expanding multimodal travel options. Throughout the environmental assessment process, the Rushline project team conducted extensive public and agency coordination. With the general public, we spoke with more than 3,400 people at more than 160 engagement events, like the picture you see here at Fiesta Latina. On the agency side, we formed project advisory committees of our agency partners and also conducted several resource-specific agency meetings with the Army Corps of Engineers, Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and more. The environmental assessment evaluates a build alternative, which includes bus rapid transit between Union Depot in St. Paul and downtown White Bear Lake. The build alternative is evaluated both with and without a park and ride at the Highway 36 station. A no-build alternative is also evaluated for comparison. We will now walk through a summary of potential impacts to the resources evaluated in the environmental assessment. These resources are evaluated for potential impacts on a scale of no concern, short-term impacts or construction impacts, and longer-term impacts associated with the Rushline BRT project. Starting with transportation resources, the environmental assessment reports that short-term and long-term impacts are anticipated in the areas of traffic, transit, parking, driveways and loading zones, and pedestrian and bicycle facilities. For freight rail, short-term impacts are anticipated, and for aviation facilities, no concern for potential impacts was noted. To more specifically address potential impacts to transportation resources, under traffic, queuing issues were identified at certain intersections. This will be addressed by adjusting turning lanes and implementing transit signal priority and traffic signal phasing. Under transit, the Rushline BRT is expected to attract new riders. Any potential temporary stop relocations, closures, or bus route detours would be communicated in advance. Under parking, driveways, and loading zones, with the build alternative, there would be a net gain of parking spaces in the corridor. However, without the Highway 36 park and ride, there would be a net loss of parking spaces. Regarding other permanent impacts, no loading zones would be affected. There is loss of one driveway in a commercial area. That property does have access to other driveways. To minimize temporary impacts during construction, there would be a construction staging plan. For pedestrian and bicycle facilities, new connections and upgrades would be made to existing facilities. Segments of the Bruce Vento Regional Trail would be reconstructed, and the planned in-street bike lane on Phelan Boulevard would not be built, but the adjacent Bruce Vento Regional Trail is available to cyclists. For freight rail, no permanent impacts are anticipated, but temporary construction easements would affect small portions of 3 railroad properties. In the evaluation of community and social resources, it was identified that land use compatibility and environmental justice resulted in no concern for impacts. Neighborhoods and community resources, land acquisitions and relocations, visual resources, and economics all result in both short-term and long-term impacts. For safety and security, short-term impacts are anticipated. For neighborhoods and community resources, the Rushline BRT project would improve access to many community facilities in the corridor. Minor partial acquisitions would be required along the edge of community facility properties, but would not include any buildings or impede any property's primary use. During construction, traffic detours, sidewalk closures, and noise and dust may temporarily affect traffic patterns and neighborhood character. Under land acquisitions and relocations, no full acquisitions would be required. All acquisitions, whether temporary or permanent, would be partial acquisitions that would not include any buildings or impede on the primary use of any property. In the evaluation of visual resources, it was determined that construction of the BRT guideway and stations would create moderate to high visual contrast in some locations of the corridor, in both the short term and long term. Mitigation measures include change in station locations in some areas and creation of the Ramsey County Rail Right-of-Way Design Guide, which was created in coordination with the public and key stakeholders. Under economics, there would be no full commercial property acquisitions or business displacements. There would be some partial temporary construction easements and permanent acquisitions needed. Temporary and permanent loss of on and off street parking spaces is not anticipated to have adverse impacts. During construction, there would be short-term impacts to businesses. To address impacts related to safety and security, safety programs, public information efforts, and other measures would be implemented to mitigate potential safety risks posed by construction activity. Safety and security plans for Rushline BRT operations would be created in coordination with local law enforcement and emergency response personnel. Where short-term closures may be needed during construction, detour routes would be created for pedestrian, bicycle, and vehicle traffic. On the subject of environmental justice, based on comprehensive analysis, no disproportionately high and adverse effects on minority and low-income populations were identified in the study area. The project is anticipated to have benefits to these populations, including improved access to community facilities and overall economic benefits. In the evaluation of physical and environmental resources, both short-term and long-term potential impacts were identified for utilities, water quality and stormwater, hazardous materials, and protected species and wildlife habitat. Short-term impacts were identified for geology, groundwater and soils, and noise and vibration, as well as air quality. Long-term impacts were identified for surface waters. Both energy and farmlands are expected to be of no concern. Regarding utility impacts, permanent impacts can be avoided, minimized, and mitigated with input from utility owners. Minimal service disruptions are anticipated to occur during construction. Utility owners would decide if these happen and when they happen. For surface water, there are floodplain impacts resulting from stormwater management features or modifications to the roadway. Mitigation is being coordinated with watershed districts and other appropriate agencies. For wetlands, the project is anticipated to impact just over 1 acre across 5 wetlands, which are regulated under the Minnesota Wetland Conservation Act. Of these impacts, about 1/4 of an acre across 3 wetlands are under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers under the Clean Water Act. For water quality and stormwater, approximately 27 acres of new impervious surface and 26 acres of reconstructed impervious surface are anticipated. Mitigation will be coordinated with watershed districts, the Minnesota Department of Transportation, and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Potential locations for stormwater management features, like ponds or underground elements, were included in the evaluation of the project. During construction, paved and vegetated areas would be disturbed, requiring temporary stormwater management. For geology, groundwater, and soils, no permanent impacts are anticipated, but during construction, dewatering would be coordinated with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources if needed. Erosion control measures will be used as needed, and if any soils are removed, they will be disposed of or reused in accordance with local ordinances. Regarding hazardous materials, site mitigation and management of contaminated and regulated materials would occur as needed. It is anticipated that no hazardous or regulated materials would be produced as part of the Rushline BRT project. Any waste from vehicle upkeep would be performed in accordance with industry standards. For noise and vibration, no long-term impacts are anticipated. Temporary noise impacts may result from construction, and a noise and vibration control plan will be provided to mitigate these impacts. For air quality, no long-term impacts are anticipated, but during construction, temporary road closures or capacity reductions may result in traffic detouring to parallel roadways. This may increase emissions and air pollutants temporarily. These are not anticipated to generate concentrations exceeding air quality standards. U.S. Environmental Protection Agency recommended measures would be used to reduce these short-term impacts. In consideration of protected species and wildlife habitat, no adverse impacts are expected to protected species in the project area. Habitat for the endangered rusty-patched bumblebee and the candidate for listing monarch butterfly is present within the project corridor. Any potential impacts to habitat will be mitigated by commitment to reseed disturbed areas with native seed mixes. There is also potential to encounter the state-protected Blandings turtle during construction. Best practices from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources will be followed for work within or near the turtle's habitat. Short-term impacts will be mitigated through erosion control, stabilization, and other best management practices. Both short-term and long-term potential impacts have been identified as a result of the Rushline BRT project for Section 4F resources and historic properties. Section 6F properties are not present within the corridor. These properties are governed by Section 4F of the Transportation Act of 1966. Section 4F is a federal law that protects publicly owned parks, recreation areas, and wildlife and/or waterfowl refuges, and publicly or privately owned significant historic sites. The 4F evaluation of impacts considers if a project would permanently incorporate or temporarily occupy any such land, or would substantially impair protected features due to the project's proximity. A project cannot use a Section 4F resource unless the Federal Transit Administration determines that the project would have a de minimis impact, or that there is no feasible and prudent avoidance alternative, and the project includes all possible planning to minimize harm to the 4F property. For the Rush Line BRT project, the Federal Transit Administration has complied with Section 4F by identifying the protected properties within the project area, consulting with the officials that have jurisdiction of those properties, assessing potential impacts and examining ways to avoid those impacts, and identifying potential minimization and mitigation strategies. As a result of this analysis, the Federal Transit Administration has determined that 4 properties in the corridor result in Section 4F de minimis impacts. These are East Side Heritage Park and Phelan Park in the city of St. Paul, Harvest Park in the city of Maplewood, and Weaver Elementary School. It has also been determined that the project will result in a Section 4F use of the following historic sites: the Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad Corridor Historic District in the segment from St. Paul to White Bear Lake, and 3 segments of the 1868 alignment of the same railroad, located between Eldridge Avenue and County Road B East, Jervis Avenue and County Road C, and Coleman Avenue and Beam Avenue. Evaluation of historic properties requires compliance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. This requires federal agencies to consider the effects of their undertakings on historic properties. An historic property is any prehistoric or historic district, site, building, structure, or object included in or eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. We commonly refer to these resources as architectural or above ground, or archaeological or below ground. The National Register of Historic Places is an official list of properties recognized for their significance in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture. To be listed, a property must retain sufficient integrity to convey its significance and meet one or more of the following criteria. Criterion A, associated with events, activities, or broad patterns of history. Criterion B, associated with persons significant in the past. Criterion C, associated with characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction. Or Criterion D, which indicates the potential to yield additional historic information. There are 4 primary steps in the Section 106 process. In step 1, the process is initiated by inviting the State Historic Preservation Office, Tribal Historic Preservation Offices, and other interested parties into consultation. These are called consulting parties. And in the Rushline BRT project, we have consulting parties from each of the communities in the corridor, including representatives from the 2 historical societies and the 2 heritage preservation commissions. In step 2, historic properties within a defined area of potential effects are identified. In step 3, it is assessed how those historic properties might be affected by the proposed project. In step 4, if any adverse effects are identified, these are resolved by reaching an agreement with consulting parties on measures to avoid, minimize, or mitigate the effects. In the assessment of effects, the Federal Transit Administration has determined that the Rushline BRT project will have an adverse effect on historic properties. Specifically, the project will have no adverse effect on 14 identified historic properties, no adverse effect with conditions on 9 historic properties, and an adverse effect on 5 historic properties. These properties include 2 segments of the Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad Corridor Historic District and 3 segments of the railroad's 1868 alignment. The adverse effects to these resources are being resolved through consultation and are documented in the draft memorandum of agreement that is included in the environmental assessment. The Section 106 Memorandum of Agreement outlines the measures identified to avoid, minimize, or mitigate any adverse effects, identifies design, development, and review processes that will be followed before construction and during construction. It is available for public review and comment right now during the environmental assessment comment period. Public comments will be considered by the Federal Transit Administration in consultation with the Minnesota State Historic Preservation Office and all of the consulting parties prior to the agreement being finalized. The final document and associated reporting will be available at rushline.org.
Thank you, Jessica, for the summary of the environmental assessment process. I'd now like to speak a few words about the next steps in finalizing the environmental assessment and the environmental assessment worksheet. The comment period is running through June 25th, and in addition to the virtual open houses, we'll have an in-person open house on June 17th. This summer, we also expect concurrence from officials with jurisdiction on de minimis impacts to Section 4F resources. Section 4F resources deal with impacts to parks. And we'll also be finalizing the Section 106 Memorandum of Agreement. The Section 106 deals with historic and cultural property impacts. In the October timeframe, the Federal Transit Administration will issue an environmental decision document, and this will include final Section 4F determination. Ramsey County will also issue the state environmental decision document. The Federal Highway Administration will issue the environmental decision document as a cooperating agency, and this is needed for interstate right-of-way use approval where the project crosses over Interstate 694. In the fall-winter timeframe, the Rushline BRT project will transition to the Metropolitan Council once the environmental decision is reached. Metropolitan Council will be the lead local agency responsible for design, construction, and ultimate operation of the Rushline BRT project. We are now going to transition into the discussion portion of this virtual open house.
All right. Thanks, folks, for listening to the presentation. We are moving back into our question and answer portion of today's meeting. Really quickly, before we dive into the questions, if you want to submit a comment on the environmental assessment, anything you've heard in the presentation today, and it's not a question but a comment, please submit it in writing to info@rushline.org, the email address, or you can find a form on the rushline.org website, or you can send a letter via the mail to Andy Gitzloff at the address shown on the screen. As we mentioned before, substantive comments will be responded to in the environmental decision document, which will be published this coming fall. So now we will move into our question and answer period. If you would advance the slide, please. And we just have a few guidelines for the question and answer period. First of all, we are really intending this section to be for a dialogue between you all as attendees and staff to ask questions and have them answered. So please stay on topic, please be respectful. If you have a comment, please submit it in the methods we just mentioned. You can ask your questions a couple of ways. We've seen a lot of questions already come in on the written in the Q&A chat feature, and we'll get to those first. You can also raise your hand, and after we're through the written questions, we will do verbal questions. The folks who will be answering your questions are listed here on the slide: Andy Gitzloff and Frank Alarcon from Ramsey County, Barbara Howard from the Minnesota Department of Transportation, Jeannie Witzig, Jessica Lobbs, and Jim Gersima from the consultant team. And then finally, you notice we did record this meeting. We are recording this meeting, and a summary of the questions and answers submitted today will be provided in that final environmental document released this fall. So without any further ado, it's 12:45 right now. We have 45 minutes remaining. We'll start in on the written questions we received. The first question we received was from, and I apologize if I mispronounce any names, from Kashif Mahmood, and asking about impacts to a business along Highway 61. And I think we'll turn this one over to Andy Gitzloff to respond.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Adele. And thanks for sending over the address as well. And based off where your address is located, we can just quickly address that there wouldn't be any temporary or permanent property impacts from the project. And generally the project on Highway 61 from Berkeley Road to about Whitaker, the way that the dedicated BRT lanes are going to be put in is converting shoulder space into an extra lane that would be just for the buses, but would also allow right turns and business access from it. And then once we get north of Whitaker Avenue, the buses would simply run in mixed traffic as they currently do today. So there wouldn't be any impacts to property north of Whitaker on 61. During construction, there would be some points where, particular at Whitaker and then up at 7th and 8th Street, where construction work would need to take place. And I'd like to just maybe turn over to Jim Gersima for a second to just touch on some of the mitigation measures that happen during construction to ensure access to businesses.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. So in White Bear Lake, there at those two locations that Andy mentioned, there will be construction activity. And that's going to look a lot like your typical normal roadway construction work. And so through that process, there will be a traffic management plan put in place that will direct traffic around and through the construction zones, and everything, all access to properties will be maintained during that entire construction season for that work there.
Thank you, Jim and Andy. We'll move on to our next question submitted by Yang Lor, asking about plans for snow removal along the Bruce Vento Trail and the Rush Line bus guideway.
All right, thank you, Del. I'll take this one as well. So in the portion of the corridor where the Rush Line guideway will be co-locating with the Bruce Vento Regional Trail, there will be a dedicated maintenance plan put in place to remove the snow. All that snow will remain on Ramsey County property. The corridor that Ramsey County owns through that portion of the alignment is 100 feet wide. So there is sufficient room in there for the removal of snow from the trail and the dedicated guideway. Really, this is very similar to how snow is removed on any residential type street, where it is piled just beyond the curb line. And then the project's stormwater management plan will take care of how that snow melt is handled there as we transition to the spring and then the snow starts to go away.
Great. Thanks, Jim. So our next question, also from Yanglor, is about safety for people using Rush Line and other public transportation. Andy, I'll turn this one over to you.
I'm sorry, it broke up for it. Can you repeat question?
Certainly. So the question is about, with an increase in hate crimes, what will be done to help keep public transit riders safe?
Yeah, And a few things that are done as far as best practices go in the Twin Cities is that there would be multiple security cameras. Stations also have the emergency call buttons. We're also looking at open layouts at stations that are well covered and positioning of lighting, so you don't have that areas that aren't well lit. BRT stations as well as the park and ride lots also have similar security features. Metro Transit does have its own uniform and plainclothes Metro Transit Police Department that continually patrol transit routes, vehicles, and stations, and also do fare inspection on the vehicles. And then buses themselves are also equipped with security cameras. And then the bus drivers also can serve as an eye on the street and have that instant radio and silent communication capacity with police dispatch going forward.
Thanks, Andy. All right, our next question is also from Yanglor. On slide 16 of the presentation, if we could navigate there, it was the diagram that showed where we are in the decision-making process. And they asked for confirmation of where we are in that process.
Yes, and I can take that one. So on that particular slide, if we're getting back there, we are on step 1, which is the comment period for the environmental assessment. So we're in step 1 of 6 in the decision-making process on the environmental assessment.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jessica. I think we were actually referencing a different
slide.
Yes. I just want to make sure that folks are oriented
on the projects.
Sorry, this is all one big file. There we go.
So yes, we are currently in step 1.
All right, so agencies and public review and comment on the environmental assessment. So our next question is from Marcy Eksted, asking if we will be talking about the incorporation of the Lower Phelan Creek project during the presentation. I will look to Frank to address this question.
Sure, thank you, Adele. So the Lower Phelan Creek project is an organization based on the east side of St. Paul that is advocating for daylighting Lower Phelan Creek between Lake Phelan and the Mississippi River. This creek has been was put underground about a century ago by people, and this organization is looking for opportunities to bring this creek to the surface so that the people and wildlife can enjoy it. And so Ramsey County has been collaborating with Lower Phelan Creek project for a few years now to find opportunities to incorporate elements of the daylighted creek vision into the Rushline project's design, and specifically the stormwater design for the Rushline project. And so we've, in addition to working with Lower Phelan Creek project, we've collaborated with the city of St. Paul and the watershed district that has watershed jurisdiction in the area. And through this coordination, we've identified a couple of points along the Rushline project route where we can incorporate aspects of the daylighting project into the Rushline scope. And so there are a couple of locations along the project route near Phelan Boulevard. So one is near Arcade Street and Nide Lane, and the other location is near Earl Street and Frank Street, where the Rushline stormwater design brings water to the surface kind of in a way that's reflective of the creek daylighting project. The design of the Rushline project is still at a fairly preliminary stage, and so as the design continues in the years to come, we intend to continue to collaborate with Lower Phelan Creek project, and we look forward to that. And also that coordination is addressed in the environmental assessment document.
Excellent. Thanks, Frank. I've got another question here for you, asking about whether Ramsey County has polled users of the Bruce Vento Trail and adjacent residents to the Bruce Vento Trail to ask how they feel about the Rushline BRT project.
Yes, thank you, Adele. So we have done extensive community engagement with. Sorry, I'm hearing some. Okay, so we have done extensive community engagement with both users of the Bruce Vento Regional Trail and people who live along the Bruce Vento Regional Trail to get input on the design of the Rush Line and the future Bruce Vento Regional Trail when the two are sharing the Ramsey County rail right-of-way, which Ramsey County acquired in the early 90s to preserve for future transit use. So 2019 was a year in particular when we did quite a bit of community engagement along the trail. We sent a mailing to property owners who are adjacent to the trail and about a block or two off the trail as well. We organized a series of pop-up events at different points along the trail to talk to people about what they like about the trail, what they want us to emphasize as the design of the Rushline project continues. So the kind of the product of all of that engagement can be found on the Rushline website. If you go to rushline.org and navigate to the project library page, you'll find a document called the Ramsey County Rail Right-of-Way Design Guide. So that's a document that's essentially a blueprint for how the trail will be designed over the coming years as part of the Rushline project. It includes a lot of detail about kind of the spacing between the trail and the Rushline's guideway. It talks about vegetation, buffers, a lot of the questions that people ask about the future design of the trail are addressed in that Ramsey County Rail right-of-way design guide. So I would encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested in learning more about the future of the regional trail.
Sounds good. Thank you, Frank. We have a couple of questions about surface water and water quality, and one question about what it means that the project has a long-term impact with surface water and water quality. And then related to that, a question about salt running off the busway into Lake Phalen. And I wonder maybe if Jessica, you might address those questions.
Yes, and I saw it was a concern too about does that affect our drinking water or that sort of thing. And no, so what we're talking about with surface water impacts is we know the project is going to add some what we call impervious surface, so hard surfaces where maybe it's a little harder for water to soak in and it ends up, running off. So in acknowledgement of that, and that some of that might end up in some of those surface waters, wetlands, ponds, the lake, we have identified those resources and then identified ways to control that runoff both during construction and permanently during operation of the project. So that's done through some vegetative means and also stormwater ponding and that sort of thing to make sure that we're protecting lakes like Lake Phalen and other water features in the project area.
Thanks, Jessica. So we have two questions about the Highway 36 park and ride, the need for the park and ride with a park and ride already existing at Maplewood Mall, and also the plan to address any potential negative interactions with Harvest Park and the planned park and ride. I will turn this one over to Andy.
And sure, I can address it. And there's more detail on the ridership projections in the environmental assessment document. And we are looking at utilizing the Maplewood Mall Park and Ride. Pre-pandemic, it was roughly about half full. And our projections show that Rushline would use the remaining approximately 500 stalls for the service. But when you look at the broader demand area, that is not enough to capture all the potential demand. And one of the key goals of the project is to serve as many riders as possible. The 36 Park and Ride within Harvest Park does provide that additional advantage of serving more riders, particularly riders that may be coming more from the eastern direction, from the northern direction. And that's also part of the reason we're evaluating both, do we build it or not build it, and even an option, whether it's a structured or just a surface parking lot, is we want to get that decision right before making that investment. And as far as if we do proceed with the Harvest Park component of the project, which has been showing to generate more overall ridership, to deal with things like trash collection, safety, and security. For any of the transit related elements, that would be a Metro Transit responsibility. If there's any shared elements that are, used for the park on the weekends or things like that, or incidental type use, that would be a city responsibility. One of the things that typically gets done as projects advance is you have a cooperative agreement or a maintenance agreement between a number of different agencies, and that'll spell out the overall roles and responsibilities for the maintenance and upkeep.
Thanks, Andy. So we have a couple questions here about electric buses. Someone asked that they recently read that Metro Transit will not be purchasing electric buses and has decided to buy biodiesel buses instead. Is that the intention for the Rush Line? And I think I'll hand this one also back to Andy.
Sure. Yeah. So for the Rush Line BRT project, our assumptions, and you'll see it in the environmental assessment, are for an electric bus fleet as part of this project, and that is what we're moving forward with in the planning phase. A lot of the biodiesel purchase from Metro Transit, they've tested some of their electric buses on a different corridor, the C line, and have not had results that are as good as they'd expect with things such as range, performance, and charging infrastructure. So it's not that Metro Transit hasn't stopped pursuing the electric buses, but one of the things that we'll be looking at in the next couple of years is, can battery technology improve? Can the charging infrastructure improve? And how might we be able to get that in time for when Rush Line purchases its buses? The good news is that technology is improving almost on a monthly basis. And this corridor, its opening days and projected till 2026. So there is some time to continue to test that, but that is something we'll work with Metro Transit on to figure out what that ultimate fleet looks like.
Thanks, Andy. Next questions are about wildlife in the Rush Line corridor, specifically efforts to keep natural wildlife from crossing the path of the buses and getting hit by buses. And then also a question about how the project might affect the rusty patch bumblebee habitat near Lake Phelan. And I think Jessica.
Yes, I can take those. So I guess the first question about the wildlife crossings, certainly that has been something that we have heard in our outreach and have considered, and the same right-of-way design guide that Frank mentioned before, I would also refer people to that for some additional information about that issue. But ultimately, there are still a lot of those particulars that will be determined as the design progresses. But we are keeping that in mind in terms of the sight lines available, to the BRT to be able to see some of that. There also may be some fencing to deter those types of wildlife crossings, or rerouting certain wildlife to safer locations to avoid the BRT and trail user interactions. That could also include, for smaller animals and reptiles, culverts placed under the pavement sections to reduce any potential for conflicts at grade. So we definitely have that in mind, and I would certainly encourage you to check out that design guide document for more detail.
Thanks, Jessica.
And on the rusty patch bumblebee. So I mean, the commenter mentioned here, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the governing authority on that issue, and we have consulted with the Fish and Wildlife Service And as the project progresses, we'll continue to coordinate on this issue. I just want to remind folks that, in the environmental assessment, we do say, based on our consultation, that the project may affect, but is not likely to adversely affect the rusty patch bumblebee. It does recognize those acres of grassland habitat that are within the potential area of disturbance, and that those are within the high potential zone, but we are following the direction of the Fish and Wildlife Service here. And will be, limiting the initial disturbance to timeframes outside of the active season, and certainly would envision that there's some coordination that can be done with the community when that time comes, and any areas disturbed would be reseeded with pollinator friendly native seed mixes, and certainly things that would benefit the bee and other pollinators.
Thanks, Jessica. So another question about trees, asking if they will be clear cut along the Bruce Vento Trail for construction. And I think this is a question for Jim.
All right, thank you, Adele. There will be tree removal within the Ramsey County corridor as part of the construction activities. We know that with construction like this, it's difficult to maintain the health of trees, and some are in direct conflict with the improvements that we are proposing. Those tree removal will be limited to the Ramsey County portion and Ramsey County property in the corridor, and not all trees within that corridor will likely need to be removed. We are analyzing the impacts of quite a few trees to be removed as part of the project to make sure that we're showing an appropriate level of disturbance at this point and this level of design. But that is limited to the Ramsey County property in the corridor, and not showing impacts and tree removal on private property adjacent to the Bruce Vento Trail. And then there will be a revegetation plan also proposed as part of the project, and that is covered in that design guide that Frank mentioned earlier. And so with the reconstruction of the Bruce Vento Trail within the corridor adjacent to the guideway, and then the revegetation plan and landscaping associated with that, there will be new trees introduced into the corridor as part of the project.
Thanks, Jim. So our next question is about whether ridership for the Rush Line will come back after the pandemic, and if the project is making any adjustments for remote work habits. I'll turn this one over to Andy.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Adele. So while transit ridership has declined during the pandemic, not only in our region, but throughout the country, the Rush Line BRT project remains a long-term investment in our region's transportation system. And we expect people to continue to count on transit to meet their transportation needs. So we are continuing the planning during the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, in a lot of areas, the pandemic's underscored the importance of transit in providing essential workers with some means to get to work and provide essential services. There was a lot of protocols that were put in place to limit the number of people on buses and encourage people not to take transit during the pandemic. And now that those are lifting, we are seeing a rebound. As far as looking towards the future, we know that many people are still working remotely, but many are starting to return. A lot of studies have shown that less than 40% of jobs can be done from home, and the remaining 60% cannot be done remotely. As the restrictions slowly relax and we navigate a new normal, the county and its partners are continuing to look to the future to see how the transportation system can help with that overall economic recovery. Even so, after the pandemic, people are going to need to get to work, educational opportunities, daily errands and appointments, and recreation. And as people adjust to new working styles, we do expect that commuting patterns will look differently. One of the key elements is the fast, the frequent, and all-day service that the Rush Line BRT will provide to residents at any time without a schedule. This works really well when we start to see schedules that are more consistent throughout the day than the peaks and the valleys. Lastly, we will continue to monitor the trends as we come out of the pandemic related to COVID-19 and be flexible and make adjustments where needed going forward.
Thanks, Andy. A couple questions now about the Bruce Vento bike trail. If the plan has been drawn out for where the bike trail will be rebuilt, and if there will be improvements to the trail along Phelan Boulevard. Jim, can you answer these?
Yeah, I can. Through the early planning and design of the project that this environmental review is based off of, there is a plan for where in the corridor the Bruce Vento Trail will be reconstructed, and so that is included in the 15% plans, as we call them, as part of the environmental documents. That does show improvements, like we've mentioned in that design guide, to associate the trail and the guideway and those pedestrian facilities and amenities all together, with some reach vegetation and landscaping and other trail amenities. What that does also show is how the trail and the guideway and the transit stations will interact together. So that design guide has a lot of details on that aspect of it.
Thanks, Jim. So the next question is asking if we would please explain what a permanent acquisition means and who or what that would impact. Jessica, can you answer this one?
I am happy to. So a permanent acquisition is one that's required that the project acquire to accommodate the BRT project. So this would be land that is held by a number of different users in the corridor. But one thing I want to emphasize is that we are not taking any full parcels as part of the project, which means we're not acquiring any buildings or taking someone's, full parcel. Most of our permanent acquisitions are partial, or all of our permanent acquisitions are partial, which means in many cases kind of a strip maybe along the existing roadway right-of-way that's needed just to accommodate a little bit of a wider cross-section. So that would be done through a process with each property owner. And again, it's across a few residential properties, but mostly commercial and institutional properties. And for further detail on that, I'd encourage looking at Table 9 in the environmental assessment, which gives the amounts in each city and the types of impacts that would be incurred.
Thanks, Jessica. Our next question is about whether the Tribal Historic Preservation Office has any input on the impacts this work. And Barbara, would you be willing to answer this one?
I sure can. Thank you for the question. The project does not go through any land under the direct jurisdiction of a Tribal Historic Preservation Office, but FTA, as part of their government-to-government relationship with the tribes, invited all the tribes that have an interest in the project area to be part of consultation under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. None of the tribes asked to be part of consultation when they were invited. We've also, FTA also reached out to them when we started developing the memorandum of agreement. They can always come into consultation at any time.
Great, thank you, Barbara. So we have a question about plans to block noise and sight of buses along the Bruce Vento Trail. Jim, could I look to you to answer this one?
Absolutely. And so in regard to sight lines and noise between the Ramsey County corridor where the Bruce Vento Trail and Guideway are and adjacent properties, there isn't any plan at this point to erect noise walls or other visual barriers between that. We do want to make sure that the trail is still accessible from adjacent properties, and we don't want to put any barriers up there. With the intention on using electric buses in the guideway corridor, we do anticipate low level of noises in the area, but there still will be seen from the corridor from adjacent properties potentially. There's just the revegetation plan and the existing tree cover in the area to help block some of those sight lines. But if the trail is able to be seen now, it will be able to be seen in the future.
Thanks, Jim. So relatedly, we've got a couple of questions about children accessing the Bruce Vento Trail and adults for that matter, staying safe and not being hit by buses in the guideway. And a related question about whether the local roads will have crossing arms and if there will be noise associated with those crossing arms.
Yeah, I'll take that one as well,
Thank
Adele. In terms of safety, that's something on the forefront of all of our minds, and definitely Metro Transit and Ramsey counties as well. The context of the guideway and the adjacent trail is very similar to a local street that would have a trail next to it as well. Even more so that the guideway will only have up to 6 buses in each direction in those peak hours. And so it's a really low volume roadway, but it carries a lot of people on those buses. We also have professional drivers that are operating those buses. And so the design that's put forth does take safety in effect in terms of how the landscaping and proposed revegetation will help guide people to be on the trail and not the guideway. But we do feel that it is a safe environment for both trail users to be co-located with that transit use. In terms of the crossings of streets, there are not gate arms proposed for this transit way. And so this is different than how a light rail would cross local streets. There will be enhanced crossing treatments there, either with traffic signals or other devices to make it clear that it is a transit crossing of local roads, but there are not any gate arms proposed that have additional noise on bells and things of that associated with them. It's typically a traffic signal that gives the buses an indication of when it's their turn to cross.
Thanks, Jim. So it's 1:15. We have about 15 minutes remaining. I wanted to just pause for a moment since we've had lots of written questions and ask our interpreters who are listening on the channels if there are any verbal questions that would want to be asked in languages other than English. We'd address those right now. Blanc or Maria or Anna, do you have any questions in your channels? Okay. Yep, I can hear you. Thank you. I think I'm just waiting to hear from Blanc. Hold on 1 second. Anna, can you stand by for just a second? Let me hear what Blanc has to say and then I'll come back to you. Blanc, can you say that again, please? Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Anna, did you have any questions from your channel? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we'll proceed with answering the remainder of the written questions in the time that we have left. Oh, that's interesting. It seems that others can't hear the interpreters, so I'm just confirming that there are no questions coming from our other language channels right now. So we'll continue with the English written questions for now. So the next question is about a pinch point around County Road F and gets tight at Whitaker and continues down Highway 61. Will Rush Line cause Highway 61 to become a one-lane road in each direction along in this area? And maybe I will look to Jim to answer this question.
Yeah, thank you, Adele. I think the simple answer is no. Rush Line is not showing or proposing that Highway 61 be reduced to one lane in each direction anywhere in the corridor. At Whitaker Street, where the roadway is more constrained and there's not that existing shoulder space to be converted into a dedicated transit lane, there is proposed full reconstruction of the highway shown there at that station location, really between White Bear Avenue and Whitaker Street. That's to accommodate that station construction and that transit advantage at that station, at that location. North of Whitaker Street, then the Rush Line operation will occur in mixed traffic through the remainder of White Bear Lake, and that's consistent with what we said earlier in the Q&A session.
Thanks, Jim. So Andy, I think this next question is for you about why the mode of transit on the Rush Line is bus instead of light rail.
Sure, yeah, and as Frank said before, we had a previous study that looked at a number of different rail and bus alternatives and route options. The selection of BRT instead of rail, it's a right-sized fit for the corridor. So typically light rail is much higher peak ridership where you need longer vehicles to move people. 60-foot bus every 10 to 15 minutes seems to be about the right fit for the level of projected ridership in this corridor. BRT can also be done less capital intensive. It's typically about a third of the cost of light rail. And it has some benefits with not having the noise and vibration impacts that come along with light rail, and some of those things with gate arms and crossing distance that make it fit better within the established built environment within the Rush Line corridor.
Thanks, Andy. We'll go to a question now about asking if anyone would be meeting with homeowners along the Bruce Vento Trail that would be directly affected by having Rush Line in the backyards. Frank, can I turn this one over to you?
Sure, yes. And project staff is happy to meet with any individual property owner or renter or anybody else living or working along the corridor. We're happy to meet directly to address and discuss your concerns. The only caveat would be that we would offer that invitation starting after this formal public comment period ends on June 25th. So after June 25th, feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is on rushline.org, and we'd be glad to set up meetings with anybody in the community.
And I would just add to that, Frank, as the project moves into more detailed engineering, those are often good times to meet with property owners or do walking tours, because we'll have more design detail. It can get to that kind of nitty gritty to the feet level of the design. So stay tuned for those opportunities as well.
All right, thanks, Frank and Andy. So a question about how Rush Line buses would impact increased traffic around the new White Bear Lake Mega High School. Andy, I might turn
Sure.
this over to you first.
Yep, and this is one we've been coordinating with the White Bear Lake School District since they originally had the proposal. Probably the biggest thing is the addition of a traffic signal at 8th Street. that will help facilitate, built as part of this project, that will help facilitate traffic to the in and out of the high school as well. We're also proposing pedestrian improvements along 7th and 8th Street, which would provides another option for people to get to the transit station, but also can provide that increased accessibility to the school. We hope that some students and even staff and faculty may choose to use the BRT to commute to work, so that could again alleviate some pressure. We are continuing to coordinate with the school district on more of that traffic study impact level, and as their plans move forward and get finalized, we'll continue to refine ours as well.
Thanks, Andy. I think one more kind of combined question for Jim, asking if there's a top view and a side-by-side view of the current trail and the vision for what it will look like. Interested in understanding the width of the BRT guideway. And then also kind of following up on the snow removal question from earlier, and how water will move away from the busway.
Yeah, thank you, Adele. Going back to the first question there, I'm not aware that we've done a side-by-side comparison of the corridor where the dedicated guideway and the preferential trail will co-locate in a before and after condition. And so that is something that we can look into. But the existing corridor, as I've mentioned, is about 100 feet wide of Ramsey County property that has a 12-foot wide trail in it. Not always centered, but kind of toward the middle of that right of way. And so that leaves, there's still 88 feet of corridor that Ramsey County owns, and we are looking to use 26 feet of that 88 feet for that dedicated guideway. And so how that fits in there and how we balance the green space, the trail, and the guideway is something that we've been looking at. It's something that the design guide references and starts to show, and it's something that's shown in those 15% plans that the environmental document is based off of. There'll still be more coordination on that as the design evolves in future phases of the project, but there is space within that Ramsey County property for green space, the guideway, and the trail. In regards to snow melt, in general, water patterns are not going to change. The stormwater management plan for the project will talk about how runoff from the roadway and the trail will be collected and treated. And so it's managed before it releases into other water bodies. But runoff from green space on the edges of that corridor will take the same pattern that it takes today. If there are specific areas where there are stormwater challenges and runoff challenges, the project team can work with those individual areas and try to improve that situation going forward if there's a documented challenge in stormwater runoff that is identified in the design.
Thanks, Jim. So I think we are approaching the end of our time together today, and thanks to you all for participating and for all of your questions. We have just a couple of questions left, and I think these will be the last two questions we'll have time for. I will maybe answer one of them. Kathy, you had asked if there would be more walkthroughs like on the Bento Trail between Arlington and Maryland, and I think Andy just offered that the phase coming up for the project later this summer, this fall would be a good time for those walkthroughs. So I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. And then the last question, I think I'll send to Andy as well. If batteries don't provide enough energy for the buses, will overhead wires be used?
Yeah, overhead wires isn't something that's been considered. One thing is ideally buses are charged overnight at the garage and they have enough charge to last the entire day. But one of the techniques to really extend that out is on route chargers, typically at the beginning and the end of the line, where buses can essentially get a top off as part of the route. And then a couple of things that could be looked at as the project moves forward is, potentially a slightly smaller bus too. A smaller bus requires less energy and can extend the battery life. So those are things we'll keep looking on as the project moves forward to see how we can make the electric buses work within this corridor.
Great. Thanks. Well, that concludes our Q&A portion. Thanks to all of you for participating. I just wanted to note that in the chat, we've posted a link to the Ramsey County Rail Right-of-Way Design Guide. There were lots of questions today about the Bruce Vento Trail and how Rushline will fit in on the Ramsey County right-of-way. And that document has a lot of information and visuals about the plan. So take a look at that. And thanks everyone for participating.